America's prison system often presents itself as orderly, controlled, and sealed off from the outside world. That image is incomplete. Behind the walls, prisons absorb the same social pressures, conflicts, and inequalities shaping the nation beyond their gates. Few places demonstrate this more clearly than the path that leads to permanent lockdown facilities like United States Penitentiary Marion. Long before Marion becomes a symbol of total control, warning signs already exist elsewhere. One of them emerges in 1967, inside Missouri State Penitentiary, where racial segregation policies collide with a changing America. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing, because what happens next reveals how this system truly works. In 1967, the United States is in the middle of a national reckoning on race. Civil rights legislation is passed, but implementation is uneven. Protests, urban unrest, and political backlash dominate headlines. Prisons, however, remain largely untouched by reform. Many state institutions still operate under informal or explicit segregation. Housing assignments are divided by race. Job details favor white prisoners. Discipline is applied unevenly. Complaints are routine and ignored. Missouri State Penitentiary is one of the oldest prisons west of the Mississippi River. Its walls are massive. Its internal systems are rigid. The prison population is racially mixed, but daily life is not integrated. Black prisoners are assigned to older, more crowded cell houses. Work opportunities that offer movement, skills, or minor privileges are disproportionately reserved for white inmates. Punishment for rule violations is harsher and more frequent for black prisoners. Administrators justify these practices as necessary for security. They argue segregation prevents violence. In reality, it institutionalizes resentment. It also contradicts the broader legal direction of the country. Outside the walls, segregation is under legal attack. Inside, it is treated as routine management. Throughout the early 1960s, grievances accumulate. Prisoners file complaints through official channels. They raise concerns about food quality, medical care, and racial discrimination. Responses are slow or non-existent. The grievance system exists on paper but lacks enforcement. Guards retain wide discretion. Oversight is minimal. By 1967, tensions are constant. Small confrontations break out between prisoners and staff. Fights occur between inmates, often sparked by perceived favoritism or punishment. The administration responds with lockdowns and disciplinary segregation. These measures suppress symptoms but do not address causes. The breaking point arrives suddenly. Fights erupt across multiple areas of the prison. Guards lose control of key corridors. Fires are set in cell blocks. Property is destroyed. Prisoners barricade themselves in sections of the facility. The disturbance spreads faster than staff can contain it. Emergency forces are called in. State authorities mobilize to retake the prison. The response is forceful and immediate. Control is eventually restored, but the damage is done. The riot exposes conditions that have been ignored for years. Segregation is no longer a quiet administrative practice. It is now a visible cause of institutional collapse. Investigations follow. State officials acknowledge that racial policies inside the prison contributed to the unrest. Reports describe unequal treatment, outdated management philosophies, and a lack of accountability. Public attention briefly focuses on Missouri's prison system. Reform is discussed. Promises are made. Actual change is limited. Some housing assignments are adjusted. Language around segregation is softened. But the underlying power structure remains intact. Guards still control access to safety, movement, and opportunity. Prisoners still lack meaningful mechanisms to challenge abuse. The lesson, however, is recorded. Racial injustice behind bars is no longer invisible. The riot becomes part of a growing record showing that prisons reflect the same conflicts as the society that builds them. They are not isolated laboratories of control. They are pressure chambers. This understanding spreads through correctional circles nationwide. Administrators begin to focus less on reform and more on containment. The goal shifts from rehabilitation to control. Risk management becomes the dominant philosophy. When disorder occurs, the response is not integration or equity, but restriction. Over the next decade, prisons across the United States experience unrest. Attica in 1971 becomes the most visible example, but it is not unique. Facilities face overcrowding, racial tension, and legal challenges. Courts begin to intervene. Consent decrees mandate improvements in conditions. Administrators feel besieged. At the federal level, officials search for solutions that emphasize security above all else. The idea gains traction that some prisoners cannot be managed under normal conditions. Isolation is reframed as necessity. Long-term segregation becomes policy, not exception. This philosophy culminates in the transformation of USP Marion. In 1983, after the murder of 2 correctional officers by inmates on the same day, the prison enters permanent lockdown. All prisoners are confined to their cells for nearly 23 hours a day. Movement is eliminated. Programs are canceled. Contact is minimized. Marion becomes a model. Not an anomaly, but a template. Its regime demonstrates how total control can be maintained through isolation. Other facilities study its methods. Supermax prisons follow. The logic is clear. When unrest threatens order, remove interaction. Remove visibility. Remove risk by removing humanity. The path to this outcome does not begin in 1983. It begins earlier, in places like Missouri State Penitentiary. It begins with unresolved grievances. With racial inequality treated as operational convenience. With administrators choosing control over reform. The Missouri riot shows how segregation destabilizes institutions. It also shows how authorities respond when destabilization occurs. They do not dismantle inequality. They reinforce barriers. They centralize power. They limit movement. They normalize lockdown. For prisoners, the consequences are long-lasting. Isolation affects mental health. Restricted movement limits access to education and work. Families are distanced. Legal advocacy becomes harder. Oversight diminishes. For the public, these systems operate largely out of sight. Prisons like Marion are remote. Information is limited. Language sanitizes reality. Terms like administrative segregation obscure lived experience. The connection between racial injustice and modern lockdown prisons is not always acknowledged. But it is direct. When institutions fail to address inequality, they generate instability. When instability emerges, control replaces reform. Permanent lockdown is not an accident. It is a policy choice shaped by decades of unresolved conflict. Missouri State Penitentiary's 1967 riot does not lead immediately to supermax prisons. But it contributes to a body of evidence that administrators interpret through a narrow lens. Disorder is seen as proof that prisoners cannot self-regulate. Segregation is rebranded as safety. Isolation becomes protection. This reasoning ignores context. It ignores how discriminatory policies create the very violence they claim to prevent. It ignores how dignity and fairness reduce conflict. Instead, it reinforces a cycle. Inequality produces unrest. Unrest justifies repression. Repression deepens inequality. Today, permanent lockdown facilities are defended as necessary. They house people labeled as dangerous, disruptive, or unmanageable. The criteria are broad. The oversight is limited. Release from isolation is often discretionary and opaque. The legacy of 1967 remains embedded in this system. It is visible in how prisons respond to protest. It is visible in how grievances are managed. It is visible in whose complaints are taken seriously and whose are ignored. America's prison system does not evolve in isolation. It reacts to crises. Each riot, each disturbance, becomes a data point. The conclusions drawn from those data points shape policy for decades. Missouri's riot shows that segregation is not a neutral tool. It is a destabilizing force. USP Marion shows how the response to destabilization can redefine incarceration itself. Permanent lockdown is presented as order. In practice, it is containment. It prioritizes silence over resolution. It hides conflict rather than addressing it. It is the final stage of a system that chooses control when reform is difficult. Understanding this history matters. It reveals that modern prison practices are not inevitable. They are constructed. They are responses to specific events and decisions. They reflect values as much as security concerns. The story of America's permanent lockdown prisons is not just about architecture or policy. It is about how institutions respond when confronted with injustice. Missouri State Penitentiary in 1967 issues a warning. USP Marion institutionalizes the response. The distance between those two moments is measured in years, but the logic is consistent. When inequality is ignored, pressure builds. When pressure explodes, walls get thicker. Doors get heavier. Cells get smaller. The result is a system that mistakes isolation for safety and silence for peace. It is a system built not to heal, but to hold. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.